vertebrae, like if I said, you know, is this T1 or is this T2? I don't know. That's a good question. I do know it's a thoracic vertebrae, though. So we expect you to know what type it is, not necessarily where it's at. The only two that you have to know specifically are C1 and C2, and that's because they're very different and they provide a different function. So C1 and C2, C1 is also known as your atlas, and C2 is also known as your axis. Named so because C1 actually is where your skull articulates with your vertebral column, in which your occipital condyles sit on your C1. Okay, so that's its function. So consequently, C2 provides an axis or a point of rotation for C1 in your skull. So it allows you to move your head side to side. If those were fused together, you could not move your head side to side. So that allows that. And it has a structure that is for that, and that's this part here, that's called the dens. Okay? D-E-N-S. It might be in your notes already. It's the dens, okay? So that's just this little projection here on C2 that provides that axis of rotation, okay? So these are like the only two that you have to know. So if we asked you, what is this structure, you would say dens. Which vertebrae is it on? It's on C2, it's on the axis. Okay? And then aside from that, you just have all of these other vertebrae that are pretty similar. The only difference is like, I think, like as you, L1 is smaller than L5. They like get bigger as you go down the column. But aside from that, like, I mean, all of the lumbar look pretty much the same in terms of what we're going over. They may have structural differences that I'm not aware of, but that's another class, another time, I'm assuming. So whenever you study these and learn these, it's important to orient them correctly. In doing so, you want to make sure that this projection is always pointing downward. This is known as the spinous process. So you want that spinous process to be pointing down. Okay? If you have it pointing upward, then you have it upside down, and that's going to be a problem whenever you go to learn these other structures. Okay, so with the thoracic vertebrae, it's a lot easier to note that that spinous process is pointing down in this case. And then for the lumbar, you can kind of see it pointing down here, more so than if it's like this, right? So that spinous process always needs to be pointing down. It's what you can actually feel if you feel down your back. So that's the spinous process. You have what's known as the body. The body is this big, solid piece of bone right here. It's actually where you have your intervertebral discs of cartilage on top of and below. So that's between each of those bones. So there's the body of the thoracic vertebrae, the body of the lumbar. Okay. You have the vertebral foramen, which is where your spinal cord goes down your vertebral column. So it's just this hole right in the middle. Okay. Right there. Okay. And then for the cervical, it is this hole here. Right? Okay, so it's just a pretty good sized hole right in the middle. Then you have what's known as the transverse process. So it's these guys here, they stick out laterally from the vertebrae. So it's those two processes. Okay. On the thoracic vertebrae, it's these. These actually serve as points of articulation with your ribs in terms of your thoracic vertebrae. Okay, so those articulate with your ribs. And then for the cervical vertebrae, it's actually these two in the back here. Not these guys, but these. A little more anterior? They're actually technically more anterior. That's right, yeah. And they're a little bit smaller than these other parts. Okay, so that's the transverse process. Then you have the superior and inferior articular processes. This is why it's important whether or not you have it this way or this way, because you would get these backwards quite possibly. So these actually articulate, if you were to stack another thoracic vertebrae on top of this, the superior articular processes would articulate with the vertebrae above it, the inferior with the vertebrae below it. So here you have the superior, the cervical, the inferior right here. Okay. For the thoracic, superior, inferior, and then for the lumbar, superior right here, and inferior right here. Okay. So pretty straightforward on that.
You need to know those for the C1 and C2 though, right? Are they similar? Or?
They're kind of similar. It's not quite the same. It does look a little bit different. I don't think that we're going to ask you to know those specifically. You could come up with it. Like for C1, there's the superior, there's the inferior, there's the transverse, there's the spinous process. It looks a little different. Kind of the same thing with this one. You know, superior. Inferior is actually over here, or spinous, transverse is here. So I don't think that we would really ask you on these two. I mean, I don't like the practical, so I don't guess I can say that for sure. But I don't think, in my knowledge and in my experience, I don't think that's the way that we do it. More so on these guys. Okay? So then there's two other features that you have to know. They're not really structures or features. They're more of like areas. So you have what's called the pedicle, which is the area between the body of the vertebrae and the transverse process. Okay, so it's this area right here. Okay, on either side, it's kind of between those things. So same thing with this one: body, transverse process, pedicle.
So it's usually like a notch.
It kind of is a notch. Yeah, you could really kind of classify it as a notch. I think that'd be body, transverse, right there. Okay. And then you have what's known as the lamina. The lamina is between the spinous process and the transverse process. So it's the area right here. Okay, you see that? So between those spinous and transverse. Transverse, spinous, it's right here. Okay, on either side. Spinous, transverse is back here, right? So it's this area right there. Okay. And then there's two ID factors for cervical vertebrae. They have a split spinous process right there. And then they also have transverse foramen. Okay. Transverse foramen.
Same thing goes for the carpal.
Thanks.
What do we got?